Chapter 1. Mercy, your majesty, please. I served your father. I guarded your own doors. And yet you opened the southern gate for vain. Lorcan's voice was dead, devoid of pity, devoid of anything human. He stood over the kneeling traitor, his former captain, his broad shoulders blocking out the pale moonlight. I was forced, the man sobbed, clutching the snow. He would have killed my family. And I am making you pay for your choice. Lorcan didn't hesitate. He moved with a terrifying liquid speed. A sickening crack echoed through the frozen woods. The captain's body went entirely still, collapsing heavily into the pure white snow. It was over in a second. From her hiding spot behind a massive oak tree, Zoya stopped breathing. Her fingers dug into the icy bark. She watched the Alpha King slowly straighten up, a dark smear of blood staining his sharp jawline. He looked like a nightmare sculpted from ice and violence. That was your best captain, Lorcan Brecken, his beta muttered from the shadows. He didn't sound impressed. You didn't have to make it a public execution. Fear keeps them in line, Brecken, Lorcan replied. He wiped the blood from his face, his golden eyes glowing in the dark. If they forget who rules, I remind them. You rule a graveyard at this rate, then I will be the king of ghosts. Lorcan turned away from the body. Burn it. Zoya shifted her weight to sneak away. It was a mistake. A single, dry twig snapped under her boot. The sound was tiny, practically swallowed by the wind. But Lorcan's head snapped toward her direction instantly. His golden eyes locked onto her hiding spot with the precision of a predator. We have a rat, Lorcan murmured. Zoya didn't think. She just ran. She shoved off the tree, sprinting through the knee-deep snow, her lungs burning. She heard no footsteps behind her, no warning, just a sudden, violent rush of wind. Before she could scream, a massive hand wrapped around her throat. The impact lifted her entirely off her feet. Lorcan slammed her against the frozen trunk of a pine tree. The air left her lungs in a painful rush. "Who sent you?" he demanded. His face was inches from hers. Zoya kicked, her hands clawing desperately at his iron-hard grip. "Nobody," she choked out. "Liar," he snarled. His grip tightened just enough to bruise, not to kill. "You saw what just happened to my captain. I will ask you one more time. Who do you work for?" "I said, nobody, you psycho." She glared at him. She didn't squeeze her eyes shut. She didn't beg. She stared straight into the terrifying, glowing gold of the Alpha King's eyes, her own chest heaving as she fought for a single breath. Then it happened. The wind shifted. Her scent hit him. Lorcan's entire body went rigid. The hostility radiating from him fractured. His golden eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they nearly swallowed the irises. A violent, invisible shockwave slammed into his chest, tearing through his blood, ripping apart his legendary control. Mate. The word echoed in his mind. Primitive and absolute. The moon goddess had cursed him. He who had sworn to trust no one, to need no one, was now magically chained to a filthy spy shivering in the snow. A vulnerability he absolutely could not afford. "No," Lorcan whispered. He actually took a half step back, though his hand remained on her throat. His breathing turned ragged. "No, not you." "What are you?" he demanded, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming possessiveness that disgusted him. "Let me go," Zoya rasped. She didn't waste time trying to understand the sudden panic in his eyes. She dropped her hand to her boot. In a flash of desperate motion, she drew a silver dagger and drove it straight toward his ribcage. Lorcan caught her wrist mid-air. The silver blade stopped an inch from his jacket. His large hand wrapped around her delicate wrist, squeezing until the bones ground together. The silver proximity burned his skin, hissing against his alpha aura. But he didn't flinch. He just stared at the weapon, then back at her. Brecken stepped forward, catching the sudden shift in the air. He saw Lorcan's dilated eyes, the possessive way he hovered over the girl. The beta scoffed, a harsh sound in the quiet woods. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Brecken muttered, crossing his arms. "Don't tell me the Savage King just got leashed by a peasant with a butter knife." "Shut up, Brecken," Lorcan growled, never breaking eye contact with Zoya. "You try to kill me?" he asked her softly. The danger in his voice was suffocating. "You were going to snap my neck, Mena," she shot back, fighting his grip. "I still might. Then do it. Don't talk about it." Lorcan's jaw tightened. She was challenging him. His own mate, a fragile little human-looking thing, was daring him to kill her. His chest rumbled with a dark, terrifying growl. He twisted her wrist. Zoya gasped in pain. The silver dagger slipped from her fingers, dropping uselessly into the snow. Lorcan didn't let go. He pulled her flush against his chest. The sheer heat radiating from his massive frame was overwhelming against the freezing winter air. He leaned in, his nose grazing the sensitive skin right below her ear. He breathed her in, wildflowers, rain, and the sharp tang of fear. It intoxicated him. It made him want to burn the forest down just to keep her warm. He hated it. "You're a monster," Zoya whispered, shivering as his breath hit her neck. "I am the king," Lorcan corrected, his voice a dark rasp against her skin. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. During the struggle, a small branch had nicked her cheek. A single drop of crimson blood swelled there. Lorcan's eyes darkened. The alpha inside him roared at the sight of her blood, demanding he heal it, demanding he claim her right then and there in the snow. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward. His tongue swept over the cut, tasting her blood. Zoya froze. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. "Get off me." Lorcan released her throat. She dropped to her knees in the snow, coughing and gasping for air. He stood over her, his chest rising and falling heavily as he fought the instinct to drop down and pull her back into his arms. He looked down at Zoya, his expression hardening back into the cold, ruthless mask of a tyrant. "I should gouge your eyes out for what you just saw tonight," Lorcan said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Zoya looked up at him, rubbing her bruised throat. "Then, do it." A cruel smirk played on his lips. "No, that would be too easy. You want to see how a monster rules?" He turned his back on her, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. "Tomorrow you will wear my crown," Lorcan commanded over his shoulder. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The royal guards froze, their spears dropping a fraction. Even Brecken choked on his next breath, his sarcastic smirk vanishing instantly. Because everyone in the clearing knew exactly what that meant. The ruthless Alpha King, who had slaughtered noble daughters for looking at him wrong, had just claimed a filthy, knife-wielding prisoner as his queen. Lorcan ignored the shock radiating from his men. He pointed a single blood-stained finger at Zoya. "Take her back to the castle. Lock her in my chambers." What happens when a ruthless Alpha King locks his fiercely defiant mate in his royal chambers? Will Zoya survive the forced marriage, or will Lorcan's dark possessive instincts consume them both? The true game of power and seduction is just getting started. If you want to see Zoya fight back in Chapter 2, smash that subscribe button. Turn on the bell notifications and leave a like. Tell us in the comments below. Should Zoya try to escape, or should she play his game and claim the crown? See you in the next chapter, Chapter 2. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the metallic click of the lock echoing like a gunshot. Zoya spun around, her fists clenched. She was trapped. The Alpha King's private chambers were ridiculously massive, dripping with dark velvet and cold stone, but it was still a cage, a gilded, terrifying cage. Before she could even check the massive glass windows for an escape route, the lock clicked again. Lorcan walked in. He had stripped off his blood-stained jacket, wearing only a black button-down shirt that clung tightly to the ridiculous muscle of his chest. He didn't look like a king right now. He looked like a predator, cornering his next meal. Brecken followed closely behind, carrying a thick parchment scroll. The beta looked between Lorcan and Zoya, his mouth twitching with dark amusement. "I still think this is the worst idea you've had all century," Brecken noted, tossing the scroll onto the heavy mahogany desk. "And you once tried to fight a bear barehanded." "Leave us, Brecken," Lorcan commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. His golden eyes never left Zoya. "Try not to kill your new bride before the ink dries." Brecken smirked, stepping backward out of the room. The door shut. They were alone. Lorcan walked to the desk and tapped the parchment with a scarred finger. "Sign it." Zoya crossed her arms, standing her ground despite the trembling in her knees. "Or what? You'll rip my heart out like you did to your captain?" "If I wanted you dead, you would be buried in the snow," Lorcan stated coldly. "This is a marriage decree. You will sign it. You will stand beside me tomorrow, and you will smile at the council. Do that, and you live." "A fake marriage to a tyrant?" Zoya scoffed, taking a step forward. "Why? Because your council is demanding an heir? Because you need a puppet queen to make you look less like a monster?" "Because you belong to me," Lorcan snarled, the words tearing out of his throat before he could stop them. He hated the truth of it. He hated the invisible mate bond pulling his chest toward her. Before Zoya could fire back, a side door creaked open. Sibella, the royal sorceress, glided into the room. Her silver eyes darted between the furious king and the defiant prisoner. The air between them was so thick with tension, it practically sparked. "My king," Sibella murmured, bowing her head. She placed a small brass incense burner on the mantelpiece. "The elders are restless. I brought the moon ash incense to calm the atmosphere." "Light it and get out," Lorcan snapped, rubbing his temples. A vicious headache was building behind his eyes. Sibella struck a match. The incense caught instantly, releasing a thick, sweet smoke that smelled of crushed lavender and burnt sugar. She shot Zoya a curious, almost pitying look, then vanished from the room. Zoya glared at the parchment. "I am not signing your death warrant, Lorcan." "It is a crown, you foolish girl, not a death warrant." "It's a collar," Zoya yelled, her anger finally boiling over. "You think you can just snap my neck 1 minute and force a ring on my finger the next? I am not your property." As Zoya's fury spiked, her heart hammered wildly. Her adrenaline pumped, mixing her natural scent, wildflowers and rain, with the thick, sweet smoke of Sibylla's incense. A chemical reaction ignited in the air. Lorcan froze. Mid-step, the Alpha King stopped dead. His hands gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so hard the wood splintered beneath his fingers. He inhaled sharply, his massive chest expanding. The scent hit his senses like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just the sweet smell of a mate anymore. Sibella's magic incense, mixed with Zoya's pure, unadulterated rage, mutated into something lethal. It was a targeted, overwhelming aphrodisiac designed specifically to bypass an alpha's logic and shatter his control. Lorcan let out a ragged, agonizing groan. He dropped to one knee. Zoya jumped back, her eyes wide. What's wrong with you?" "Stop!" Lorcan choked out, his voice completely wrecked. He gripped his own throat, gasping for air. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Your scent. Stop." Zoya blinked. She looked at the smoking incense, then at the trembling king. He's weak. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. The invincible savage king, the monster who slaughtered men without blinking, was on his knees. Because of her. Zoya's breath hitched. A sudden spike of fear shot through her veins, a primal warning screaming at her to run to the door while he was down. She hesitated, her muscles freezing for a fraction of a second. But the instinct to survive, to dominate the monster who had threatened to kill her just an hour ago, was stronger. The power dynamic in the room violently flipped. Zoya didn't run. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Stop what?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Stay back, Zoya," Lorcan warned. His golden eyes flashed violently, fighting a losing battle against the feral beast inside him. "I am losing my mind. If you come closer, I will not be able to stop myself." "You want to control everything, don't you?" Zoya mocked. She took another step. The potent, intoxicating scent rolled off her in waves, suffocating him. "You want to force me to be your queen. You want to own me." Lorcan dug his fingers into his thighs, his muscles screaming under the immense strain. His mind warred brutally between the alpha's raw instinct to claim and the king's pride to resist. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged as he fought to build a mental wall against the intoxicating poison. "Zoya, I am warning you." His fangs elongated, scraping against his lower lip. She stopped right in front of him. She looked down at the king of the north, watching him tremble at her feet. "You aren't a king right now, Lorcan," she whispered, leaning down just enough so her breath ghosted over his ear. "You're just a starving dog on a leash, and I'm holding it." Her words shattered his wall. Something inside Lorcan snapped. The last thread of his legendary control vanished into the void. With a feral, deafening roar, Lorcan lunged. He was a blur of motion. Before Zoya could even scream, he grabbed her waist and slammed her backward. Her spine hit the cold stone wall with a heavy thud. Lorcan's massive body pinned her instantly, trapping her completely. Zoya gasped, her heart leaping into her throat as his face hovered inches from hers. The heat coming off his body was scorching. His golden eyes were completely gone, replaced by the pitch-black void of a fully unleashed alpha. He raised his fist, pulling it back with terrifying force. Crash! Lorcan drove his fist straight into the solid stone wall, right next to her head. Dust and cracked rock rained down on her shoulder. Zoya froze, staring into the dark, obsessive eyes of the beast. Lorcan leaned in, his chest pressing heavily against hers, his nose buried in the crook of her neck. He inhaled her deeply. His entire body shook violently from the effort of holding back the feral instinct that wanted to consume her. "You think this poison makes you the master?" He growled against her skin, his voice dark, ragged, and dripping with raw dominance. "Keep radiating your scent, Zoya. Keep pushing me. And see how I make you lose control before I do. The grand hall was a sea of glittering jewels, suffocating perfume, and quiet, festering hatred. "Keep your eyes on the doors," Lorcan ordered, his voice barely a murmur. His large hand rested firmly on the small of Zoya's back, right where the dark velvet of her gown dipped low. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a territorial warning to every predator in the room. He guided her up the steps to the royal dais, forcing the entire court to watch. "I am not your prize to parade around, Lorcan. Zoya muttered through gritted teeth, the heavy ancestral silver crown resting on her head felt like a target painted on her skull. "Tonight, you are my queen," Lorcan replied, his golden eyes sweeping the massive crowd. "Act like it, or I will start executing council members just to lighten the mood." They turned to face the 100 most powerful elites of the North. The tension in the room was sharp enough to slice through bone. Everyone knew what she was, a human, a prisoner, a nameless girl wearing the sacred silver crown of the Alpha Kings. To the pureblood wolves in the room, it was the ultimate, unforgivable insult. Brecken stood near the throne, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his broadsword. He leaned in, his voice pitched low. "They look like they want to rip her apart, Lorcan." "Let them try," Lorcan stated. He radiated an overwhelming, icy dominance, daring a single soul to step out of line. "You brought a sheep into a den of starving wolves," Brecken pointed out, scanning the dark corners of the hall. "I don't like this. The Southern Lords are too quiet. Lord Kalen hasn't even looked at you since we walked in. Kalen is a coward. He barks, but he doesn't bite. A coward with a lot of money and a very deep grudge," Brecken warned. Zoya ignored their whispering. Her sharp eyes calculated the distance to the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. 30 yards, 4 heavily armed guards. If she could just create a distraction, if she could just slip into the shadows while Lorcan was busy intimidating an elder. A servant approached the raised dais, his head bowed low and his hands trembling slightly. He held a polished silver tray carrying 3 crystal goblets of dark red wine. "A toast, Your Majesty," the servant stammered, "from Lord Kalen to the new queen." Lorcan stared at the trembling man. He reached out and took the goblet, but he didn't drink. The Alpha King brought the crystal rim toward his face. He inhaled once. His golden eyes snapped wide open. "Lorcan, don't!" Brecken started stepping forward. It was a trap, but the danger wasn't in the wine. Before Lorcan could drop the glass, the servant lunged. A hidden blade slipped from the man's velvet sleeve, glowing with a sickly, iridescent green liquid. Lorcan reacted with blinding speed, twisting his massive frame to avoid a fatal strike to his chest. But he wasn't fast enough. The glowing blade slashed across his forearm. Lorcan roared, a terrifying primal sound. He slammed his fist into the servant's chest, sending the man flying backward. The assassin crashed heavily against the stone pillars, dropping completely limp to the floor. Chaos violently erupted. Screams tore through the elegant hall. The nobles scattered like frightened prey, shoving each other to reach the exits. Lorcan gripped his bleeding arm, stumbling backward. His massive frame swayed dangerously. The veins on his neck immediately bulged, turning a horrifying, toxic shade of black. "Wolfsbane!" Brecken shouted, drawing his heavy sword. "It's the ancient strain! Guards, to the king!" But half the royal guards didn't move to protect the throne. Instead, they turned their spears on Brecken. Treason. Lord Kalen stepped out from the panicked crowd, his elegant facade entirely gone. He drew a massive steel broadsword. 5 assassins cloaked in black moved in perfect sync with him, instantly surrounding the dais. "The tyrant falls tonight," Kalen bellowed over the screaming crowd. "For the true North! Traitor!" Brecken roared, clashing his blade with the nearest corrupted guard. The beta was a phenomenal, brutal fighter, but he was instantly overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Behind him, Lorcan fell to one knee. Zoya backed away, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. This was it. The king was down. The guards were fighting each other. The doors were wide open and unguarded in the chaos. Run! Her survival instinct screamed at her. Run now! She took 3 rapid steps toward the shadows. Freedom was right there. She looked back one last time. Lorcan was on the ground, struggling violently to breathe. The ancient concentrated wolfsbane was rapidly shutting down his organs, burning straight through his legendary alpha healing. Lord Kaelin stood triumphantly over the fallen king, raising his massive steel broadsword high into the air. "Any last words, Savage King?" Kaelin sneered, anticipating his victory. Lorcan didn't look at the deadly sword. He didn't look at Kaelin. Through the agonizing pain, through his blurring vision, his golden eyes found Zoya standing in the shadows. He didn't order her to help. He didn't beg for his life. He just watched her, accepting that this was the end. Something violently shattered inside Zoya's chest. The mate bond, primitive, absolute, and undeniably possessive, exploded in her blood. She wasn't thinking about survival anymore. She wasn't planning her escape. "No!" Zoya sprinted across the stone dais. "Zoya, stay back!" Lorcan choked out, his voice a broken rasp. She didn't stop. As Kaelin swung the heavy broadsword down with all his brutal might, aiming straight for Lorcan's exposed neck, Zoya threw herself over the Alpha King. She raised her bare arm, squeezing her eyes shut, bracing for the cold steel to cleave her in two. The heavy blade struck her arm, but there was no blood. There was no pain. Crash. The sound was deafening, like a mountain violently cracking open. The heavy steel broadsword didn't slice her flesh. The moment the metal made contact with her skin, the weapon instantly shattered into 100 jagged, useless pieces. Kaelin stumbled back, crying out in shock as shards of his own sword rained down on the marble floor. Zoya opened her eyes. She wasn't dead. Instead, a blinding, terrifying purple aura erupted from her skin. It was dark, ancient, and freezing cold. The shock wave of raw, unadulterated magic blasted outward, violently throwing Kaelin and the surrounding assassins backward. They hit the stone walls with bone-crushing force. The entire grand hall plunged into absolute terrified silence. The fighting abruptly stopped. Every single person, from the noble lords to the bleeding guards, stared at the dais in pure, paralyzing horror. Zoya stood up slowly. The dark purple aura swirled violently around her feet like living smoke. She looked down at her hands, trembling as the ancient power surged through her veins. "Impossible," a voice gasped from the crowd. Sibella, the royal sorceress, pushed her way through the frozen nobles. Her face was entirely drained of color, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She stared at the shattered blade on the floor, then slowly looked up at the new queen's face. Zoya's normal brown eyes were completely gone. They were glowing a brilliant, terrifying violet. Sibella dropped to her knees, pointing a trembling finger at Zoya. "Night Walker!" Sibella screamed, her voice shrill with historical dread. "The cursed bloodline, the magic of the shadows, it's alive!" The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of panic. Chapter 4. The panic in the grand hall was deafening, but Zoya couldn't hear any of it. The violent purple energy roaring in her ears completely drowned out the screams of the nobility. The magic was ancient, massive, and entirely too powerful for her fragile body. It burned through her veins like liquid fire, tearing at her from the inside out. She looked down at her glowing hands, struggling to pull the magic back. She couldn't. "Zoya!" Lorcan's voice tore through the chaos. She turned toward him. The violet light in her eyes flickered wildly. Her vision blurred, plunging into darkness. The magic violently imploded, instantly shutting down her system. She collapsed. Lorcan, fighting the paralyzing, agonizing burn of the wolfsbane, threw himself forward. He caught her right before her head hit the marble floor. "Sibella!" the Alpha King roared, clutching Zoya's limp body to his chest. His fangs were bared, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, desperate gold. "Save her, now!" 3 days. For 3 days and 3 nights, the King of the North did not leave his royal chambers. He did not eat. He did not sleep. The heavy curtains were drawn, plunging the massive room into permanent twilight. Lorcan sat in a wooden chair beside the giant canopy bed, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked completely destroyed. The ruthless tyrant who commanded armies was gone, replaced by a haggard, terrified man staring at the pale face of the girl in the bed. The heavy door creaked open. Brecken stepped inside, carrying a stack of missives. "You need to leave this room, Lorcan," Brecken said softly. "The wolfsbane is out of your system, but the kingdom is falling apart. Lord Kaelin's men are in the dungeons, but the council is panicking." "Let them panic." Lorcan's voice was a dead, empty rasp. He didn't look away from Zoya. "She is a Nightwalker, Lorcan. The magic she used, it hasn't been seen in a century. The elders are demanding answers. They are demanding an execution." Lorcan slowly turned his head. The sheer murderous intent radiating from his golden eyes made Brecken instinctively take a step back. "If the council speaks her name again," Lorcan whispered, his voice dripping with pure venom, "I will mount their heads on the castle gates, every single one of them." Brecken sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Your father wiped them out, Lorcan. The whole continent knows the history. The royal Alpha bloodline hunted the Nightwalkers to extinction because their magic was a threat to the crown. You are protecting the ghost of an enemy. She is my mate, and she is going to start a civil war," Brecken snapped, losing his patience. "You cannot keep her here. The people will never accept a Nightwalker as queen." Lorcan stood up. He moved with the lethal grace of a predator, closing the distance between them in a second. He grabbed Brecken by the collar of his armor, slamming the beta against the heavy oak door. "I do not care about the people," Lorcan snarled, his fangs fully extended. "I do not care about the crown. If the kingdom refuses her, I will burn the kingdom to the ground. Get out." Brecken stared at his king, realizing there was no reasoning with a man completely consumed by the mate bond. The beta nodded slowly. Lorcan released him, and Brecken slipped out of the room, shutting the door quietly behind him. Lorcan walked back to the bed, his massive shoulders slumped. He looked down at his own hands. They were large, calloused, and stained with years of violence. A quiet gasp broke the silence. Lorcan froze. Zoya's eyelashes fluttered. She let out a sharp breath, her brown eyes slowly opening. The terrifying violet glow was gone, replaced by exhaustion. She blinked against the dim light, her gaze drifting around the massive velvet-draped room before finally landing on him. "Lorcan?" she whispered, her voice incredibly weak. Lorcan didn't rush forward. He didn't pull her into his arms. Instead, the savage king took a slow step backward. Then, he did something no one in the history of the North had ever seen. He dropped to his knees. The solid thud of his knees hitting the stone floor echoed in the quiet room. He bowed his head, refusing to look her in the eye. Zoya pushed herself up slightly, wincing as a dull ache shot through her chest. "What are you doing? Get up!" "I can't," Lorcan rasped. His voice was completely broken. The arrogant, dominating Alpha was entirely shattered. "Why?" "Because my hands are soaked in the blood of your people." Lorcan stared at the floor, his chest heaving with overwhelming self-hatred. "My father ordered the slaughter. My bloodline hunted yours down like animals. I am the son of your butcher." Zoya stopped breathing. The reality of Sibella's words in the grand hall suddenly crashed into her memory. Night Walker, the cursed bloodline. "I forced you into my home," Lorcan continued, his voice trembling with raw, unfiltered agony. "I threatened your life. I put a collar on you. And when the blade came down, you still stepped in front of it." He slowly looked up at her. His golden eyes were bright with unshed tears, completely stripped of his royal pride. "I am a monster, Zoya. I am a plague on this earth, and I am entirely unworthy of the bond between us. I do not have the right to touch you." He swallowed hard. "Punish me. Tell me to leave, and I will walk away. I will never show my face to you again." Zoya stared at the king. The tyrant who had held her by the throat in the snow was now kneeling at her feet, offering her his absolute submission. He was giving her the power to destroy him with a single word. The heavy silence stretched between them. Zoya didn't tell him to leave. She didn't yell. Slowly, she pushed the heavy blankets aside and slid to the edge of the bed. She reached out, her small, pale hand hovering in the air. Lorcan squeezed his eyes shut, anticipating a strike. Instead, Zoya gently placed her palm against his rough cheek. Lorcan stopped breathing entirely. A violently powerful shudder wrecked his massive frame at the contact. He leaned into her touch, his large hand coming up to gently cover hers, holding it against his face as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. "You are not your father, Lorcan," Zoya whispered softly. He opened his eyes, staring at her with pure, unadulterated devotion. The tension in the room shifted from danger to an overwhelming magnetic pull. He leaned forward, his lips hovering an inch from hers. Before he could close the distance, the castle shook. Boom! The impact vibrated through the stone walls, knocking a silver vase off the mantelpiece. A heavy, terrifying sound ripped through the winter air outside. The deafening, rhythmic blast of a war horn. It wasn't the royal guard's signal. It was an invasion. The bedroom door was violently kicked open. Brecken stood in the doorway, his broadsword already drawn, his face pale with alarm. "Lorcan," Brecken breathed heavily, looking desperately at the king. "It's General Vane. He brought the entire southern army. They have surrounded the castle." Lorcan slowly stood up. The vulnerability vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by the cold, lethal gaze of the Alpha King. "What are his terms?" Lorcan demanded. Brecken looked at Zoya, his expression grim. "He says you have betrayed the royal bloodline," Brecken reported. "He demands you surrender the Night Walker to be burned at the stake. If you refuse, he will slaughter everyone inside these walls." Chapter 5. The castle was burning. The acrid smell of smoke and ash violently breached the royal chambers, suffocating the heavy velvet air. Outside the thick glass windows, the night sky was glowing a hellish, furious orange. "We have to move," Lorcan stated, his voice a lethal calm. He didn't look at the fire. He looked at Zoya. "Can you walk?" Zoya pushed herself up from the bed, ignoring the sharp, exhausting ache in her chest. The magical outburst from the grand hall had drained her entirely, but the adrenaline was rushing back. "I can walk." "Good." Lorcan grabbed a heavy fur cloak and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. He pulled her close, his golden eyes burning with absolute terrifying determination. "Do not leave my side. Do not let go of my hand. If anyone steps between us, I will kill them." He didn't wait for her answer. He gripped her hand, his large fingers interlocking with hers, and kicked the heavy oak door open. The hallway was pure chaos. royal guards were sprinting past, shouting orders. The deafening clash of steel echoed from the lower levels. The Southern army had already breached the main gates. Brecken stood at the top of the grand staircase, his broadsword dripping. "The courtyard is compromised, Lorcan. Vane brought a battering ram. He has 300 men down there, and our inner guard is holding by a thread." "Clear a path to the eastern watchtower," Lorcan commanded, pulling Zoya behind his massive frame. "We hold them at the bottleneck." They rushed down the marble stairs. The heat from the burning tapestries was blistering, but before they could reach the eastern corridor, the massive wooden doors of the great hall exploded inward. Splinters of heavy oak rained down like shrapnel. The fighting stopped. The surviving royal guards backed away, completely outnumbered, as a sea of heavily armored soldiers flooded the hall. At the center of the invading force stood General Vane. He was a massive, imposing alpha, his graying hair pulled back tightly, his armor gleaming in the firelight. He held a battle axe stained with the blood of Lorcan's men. This was the man who had taught Lorcan how to fight, the man who had protected him when his own father went mad. "Lorcan," Vane's voice boomed over the crackling fire, echoing with the absolute authority of a patriarch. "Step forward and face your blood." Lorcan stopped. His grip on Zoya's hand tightened so painfully she almost gasped. He stepped to the edge of the staircase, placing himself entirely between Zoya and the army. "You bring an army to my home, Vane?" Lorcan's voice was dangerously low, yet it carried across the massive hall. "You slaughter my guards?" "I bring salvation to the north," Vane roared back, pointing his heavy axe directly at Zoya. "You are harboring a monster, Lorcan. The Nightwalkers are a plague. They are darkness. Your father spent his life eradicating them to protect the crown, and you bring one into your bed." "She is my mate," Lorcan stated, the words vibrating with a primal territorial growl. Vane scoffed, a harsh, disgusted sound. "A trick of the witch's magic. You are under a spell. I raised you, Lorcan. I taught you what it means to be a king. A king sacrifices everything for his people. Hand the girl over to the fire. And this ends tonight." Zoya stood frozen on the steps. She looked at Vane, then at the massive army behind him. She knew the brutal mathematics of war. Lorcan was a terrifying fighter, but he couldn't kill 300 men, not while protecting her. She gently pulled at Lorcan's hand. "Lorcan," Zoya whispered, her voice trembling but resolute, "you can't win this. They will kill you." "I am not giving you to them," Lorcan replied, not even looking back at her. "Lorcan, he's your uncle," she pleaded, the reality of the situation crushing her. "He raised you. If you fight him, you throw away everything. Your family, your throne. Let me go." Lorcan finally turned to look at her. The violent chaos of the burning hall seemed to vanish. His golden eyes were wide, desperate, and completely devoid of the savage king's cruelty. "My throne means nothing without you," he whispered. He let go of her hand. Zoya's breath hitched. For a terrifying second, she thought he was surrendering. Instead, Lorcan turned his back on her and walked slowly down the marble steps toward Vane. The heat radiating from his body spiked exponentially. The air around him began to warp and distort. "You choose the monster over your own blood?" Vane demanded, gripping his axe with both hands, bracing for the impact. "You betray the family?" "She is my queen," Lorcan snarled, the sound no longer human. "And you are a dead man." Lorcan didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. With a deafening, bone-shattering roar, the Alpha King shifted. The transformation was violent and instantaneous. Clothes shredded, bones cracked and reformed in the blink of an eye. In Lorcan's place stood a monstrous, towering silver wolf. He was massive, larger than any natural beast, his metallic fur gleaming violently in the firelight, his golden eyes locked onto Vane with pure, unadulterated murder. The invading soldiers took an involuntary step back, their courage faltering against the sheer, suffocating alpha aura pressing down on them. Vane did not retreat. He roared, swinging his heavy battle axe in a deadly arc. The silver wolf moved with impossible speed. He ducked the blade entirely, the heavy steel whistling over his ears, and lunged. The clash was brutal, short, and absolute. Lorcan's massive jaws clamped down on Vane's armored forearm. The sickening sound of metal and bone crushing under the alpha's bite echoed through the hall. Vane screamed, dropping the axe. The wolf didn't hesitate. He tore his head to the side, throwing the massive general across the marble floor like a rag doll. Vane hit the base of a stone pillar heavily. He gasped, trying to push himself up, trying to reach for a dagger at his belt. The silver wolf pinned him down. A massive razor-sharp paw slammed onto Vane's chest, cracking the heavy iron armor right down the middle. Lorcan's enormous jaws hovered inches from his uncle's face. Vane stared up into the glowing gold eyes of the beast he had raised. The fear finally broke through his pride. "Lorcan," Vane choked out, blood spilling from his lips. "I am your family." The wolf didn't blink. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, a final silent farewell to the only father figure he had ever known. Then, the massive paw pressed down with devastating, lethal force. The impact echoed sharply. Vane's body went completely still. The great hall plunged into a horrifying silence. The rebel soldiers stared in pure shock. The savage king had just executed his own blood, his own general, in front of an entire army. The silver wolf slowly stepped off the body. He stood tall amidst the flames, letting out a low, terrifying growl that promised death to anyone who dared to step forward. He had made his choice. He had shattered his past to protect his mate. The psychological toll was immediate. The beast stumbled, a sudden violent shudder racking his massive frame. The human side of Lorcan was screaming, devastated by the weight of what he had just done. He closed his eyes for just a second, his guard dropping in the wake of the emotional trauma. It was the only opening they needed. From the shadows of the destroyed doorway, a coward moved. A rebel soldier, realizing the king was distracted, stepped out and hurled a heavy spear. The tip of the weapon was coated in concentrated pitch-black poison. Zoya saw the movement from the top of the stairs. "Lorcan, behind you!" she screamed, but the warning came a second too late. The heavy spear tore through the air and struck the silver wolf squarely in the back. The poisoned steel drove deep, piercing straight toward his heart. The massive beast let out a choked, agonizing gasp. The transformation broke instantly. The silver fur vanished, replaced by Lorcan's human form. He staggered forward, his eyes wide with shock. He reached a hand back, his fingers grazing the wooden shaft of the spear protruding from his spine. "Lorcan!" Zoya sprinted down the marble stairs, practically throwing herself across the floor. Lorcan's knees buckled. The poison was blindingly fast, freezing the blood in his veins. He collapsed heavily onto the cold stone floor, right at Zoya's feet. "No, no, no," Zoya sobbed, dropping to her knees. She grabbed his face, her hands instantly covered in his blood. "Look at me. Lorcan, look at me." Lorcan's golden eyes were rapidly losing their light. He looked up at her, his jaw trembling. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a man who was finally out of time. He tried to speak, but only a sharp, ragged breath escaped his lips. His heavy hand reached up, his bloody fingers weakly grazing her cheek one last time. Then his hand dropped, and the Alpha King stopped moving. Chapter 6. Lorcan, Zoya's voice was a fragile, broken whisper. She pressed her trembling hands against his chest, right over his heart. Nothing. There was no rhythm, no heavy, reassuring beat of the invincible Alpha King. His massive chest had simply stopped moving. The brutal, suffocating silence of death settled over his body. "No," Zoya breathed. She shook his shoulders, her tears mixing with the blood on his armor. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to save me and just leave. Wake up!" A few feet away, the rebel soldier who had thrown the spear let out a breathless, victorious laugh. "The tyrant is dead," the soldier shouted, raising his sword. "The savage king has fallen." A roar of triumph erupted from the invading army. They cheered over the body of the man who had just sacrificed his entire world for one girl. Brecken, fighting his way through the crowd, froze. The massive beta dropped to his knees, his broadsword clattering uselessly against the stone floor. He stared at Lorcan's lifeless body, his face entirely hollowed out by grief. Zoya didn't look at Brecken. She didn't look at the cheering soldiers. She looked down at Lorcan's pale face. He had killed his own blood for her. He had thrown away his crown, his legacy, and his life, just to make sure she was safe, and these cowards were cheering. Something deep inside Zoya's soul violently snapped. It wasn't just sadness. It was pure, unadulterated, world-ending rage. The temperature in the burning great hall plummeted instantly. The roaring flames of the tapestries didn't just flicker. They froze. The blazing orange fire turned into a terrifying, unnatural shade of pitch black. The cheering of the rebel army faltered. The soldiers stopped raising their swords, their breath suddenly misting in the freezing air. "What is that?" a soldier whispered, taking a terrified step back. Zoya slowly stood up. She didn't look like a scared human prisoner anymore. Her dark hair floated around her face as if gravity had ceased to exist. Her eyes were no longer brown. They were glowing with a blinding, absolute violet light that pierced through the smoky darkness of the hall. "You took him from me," Zoya said. Her voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. It projected directly into the minds of every single person in the room, vibrating with ancient, terrifying power. The rebel who threw the spear stumbled backward, dropping his weapon. "Witch, kill her!" A dozen soldiers charged forward. They didn't even make it 3 steps. Zoya didn't raise a weapon. She didn't even move her hands. She simply looked at them. The shadows in the room came alive. Thick, inky tendrils of dark magic ripped out of the stone floor, shooting upward like solid steel cables. They wrapped around the charging soldiers, lifting them violently into the air. There was no blood. There was no gore. The overwhelming pressure of the shadows simply crushed the life out of them. They dropped to the marble floor in perfect, terrifying synchronization. The rest of the army completely lost their nerve. "Retreat!" a commander screamed, turning toward the broken doors. "Fall back!" "Nobody leaves," Zoya commanded. A massive shockwave of freezing purple energy blasted outward from her core. It slammed into the retreating army like a tidal wave. The heavy iron armor of the soldiers crumpled. 300 men were violently thrown against the massive stone walls, pinned there by the sheer suffocating gravity of her magic. They couldn't breathe. They couldn't scream. The entire rebel force was neutralized in a matter of seconds. Brecken watched in absolute awe, unable to move a single muscle. The legends were true. The Nightwalkers were not just magic users. They were gods of the dark. But Zoya didn't care about the army. She didn't care about the crown, the war, or the terrified council members watching from the balconies above. She immediately dropped back down beside Lorcan. The magical outburst had demanded a horrific price. Zoya's veins were turning a dark, sickly purple against her pale skin. Her body was trembling violently, tearing itself apart from the inside to sustain the ancient power. She ignored the agony. She placed both of her glowing hands directly over the spear wound on Lorcan's back. "You fought the world for me," Zoya whispered, leaning down until her forehead rested against his cold cheek. "Now I am fighting death for you." She closed her glowing eyes and pushed. Zoya forced every single ounce of her life force, her magic, and her soul directly into the Alpha King. The dark poison in his veins violently fought back, burning her hands, rejecting the magic. Zoya screamed in agony, but she didn't let go. "Beat!" she commanded the king's heart, her voice cracking. "I am your queen, and I order you to beat." A blinding flash of violet light erupted between them, so bright it forced Brecken to shield his eyes. The sheer force of the magic cracked the solid marble floor directly beneath them, and then a sound pierced the silence. Thump. It was weak at first, then louder. Thump, thump. The spear wound on Lorcan's back violently hissed. The dark poison evaporated into thin air, and the torn flesh rapidly knit itself back together, leaving only a smooth, pale scar. Zoya gasped, her lungs completely empty. The glowing violet light in her eyes flickered rapidly, then vanished entirely. Her vision went entirely black. The pain stopped. The cold took over. Zoya collapsed heavily against Lorcan's chest, her body going completely limp. A second later, Lorcan's eyes snapped open. He took a massive, desperate gasp of air, his back arching off the floor. His golden eyes were wide, panicked, and glowing with raw, untamed life. The Alpha King was back. He pushed himself up, his senses immediately returning. The smell of smoke, the freezing air, the terrified silence of the defeated army around him. And then he felt the terrible, unnatural coldness of the body resting against his chest. "Zoya?" Lorcan quickly shifted, pulling her fully into his arms. "Zoya, look at me," he commanded softly, his massive hands brushing the hair out of her face. She didn't move. Her skin was a terrifying ashen gray. Her lips were entirely devoid of color. She felt completely weightless, like a fragile doll made of ice. The panic that hit Lorcan was worse than any weapon, worse than any poison. It tore straight through his chest, shattering whatever control he had left. "No," Lorcan breathed, his voice trembling violently. He shook her shoulders. "No, Zoya. Open your eyes. That is an order. Open your eyes." Silence. "Brecken," Lorcan roared, the sound tearing his throat. "Get the healers. Get Cybella. Now." Brecken scrambled to his feet, sprinting down the corridor without a word, his face pale with dread. Lorcan pulled Zoya tighter against his chest, burying his face in her cold neck. He searched desperately for her scent, the wildflowers, the rain. It was gone, replaced only by the cold metallic smell of spent magic and death. She had traded her life for his. The realization completely broke the savage king. The ruthless Alpha, the tyrant who bowed to no one, buried his face in her dark hair and wept. He didn't just cry. He threw his head back, his golden eyes blazing with absolute world-ending despair. Lorcan unleashed a long, devastating howl. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The raw power and sorrow behind the Alpha's grief hit the castle like a physical shockwave. The massive glass windows of the great hall violently shattered. The heavy stone pillars groaned, deep cracks spiderwebbing up the ancient walls. The king had survived the war, but his world had just ended. Chapter 7. There is nothing I can do, my king. Sibella's voice trembled. She knelt beside the shattered stone floor, her hands hovering helplessly over Zoya's pale, lifeless body. Her magic consumed her life force. The Nightwalker power is too vast for a human vessel. She is gone. Get out, Lorcan whispered. Lorcan, please. Brecken started, taking a step forward. I said, get out. Lorcan's roar violently shook the remaining glass in the window frames. His golden eyes were completely feral, stripped of all reason. Everyone out, now. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his alpha aura forced them backward. Brecken grabbed Sibella's arm, pulling the terrified sorceress out of the ruined hall. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, leaving the savage king entirely alone with the silence of the dead. Lorcan looked down at the girl in his arms. Zoya was cold. The beautiful, defiant fire that had challenged him, mocked him, and ultimately saved him was completely extinguished. You don't get to win, Lorcan whispered to the empty room. He pulled her flush against his chest, rocking her slightly. You don't get to die for me. I am the king. I make the rules. He pressed his forehead against hers. His mind raced, desperately tearing through centuries of alpha lore, of ancient magic his father had tried to burn away. The mate bond. It wasn't just a chemical reaction. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a bridge between two souls. If her vessel was empty, he would just have to fill it with his own. I told you that you belong to me, Zoya, Lorcan rasped, his voice breaking with absolute devotion. And I do not let go of what is mine. He shifted, laying her gently back against the cold marble floor. He brushed the heavy dark hair away from her neck, exposing the delicate pale skin covering her collarbone. Lorcan closed his eyes, his jaw clenched, his massive fangs elongated, sharp and lethal. This was the true marking, not a political marriage, not a fake contract. This was the ancient blood-bound ritual that tied an alpha's soul permanently to his mate. If she was dead, it would kill him too. He didn't hesitate. Lorcan leaned down and buried his fangs deep into the crook of her neck. A brutal, blinding shockwave of energy exploded through the room. Lorcan groaned as the ancient magic violently fought back. The freezing, dark aura of the Nightwalker rejected his invading alpha blood. It felt like chewing on lightning. It burned his throat, freezing his veins, demanding he let go or die. He bit down harder. Take it, he commanded through the bond, forcing his overwhelming vitality, his strength, his very heartbeat down into her empty veins. Take my life, Zoya. Take all of it. The magic in the room began to warp. The freezing cold clashed violently with the scorching heat of the Alpha King. Blood and shadow mixed. For 10 agonizing, heart-stopping seconds, nothing happened. Then Zoya gasped. It was a sharp, desperate intake of air. Her back arched off the floor. Lorcan immediately pulled back, panting heavily, his fangs dripping with a mixture of crimson blood and dark purple magic. Zoya's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the exhausted, flickering eyes of a dying girl. They were brilliant, eternal, and terrifyingly violet. The power radiating from her wasn't chaotic anymore. It was perfectly controlled, anchored directly to the Alpha King's soul. She looked at Lorcan. She reached up, her fingers grazing the bleeding bite mark on her neck. She could feel him. She could feel his heartbeat thumping in her own chest. The bond was sealed. You brought me back, son, she whispered, her voice carrying a strange, ancient resonance. I would burn the afterlife to the ground to bring you back, Lorcan replied. He grabbed her face, pulling her up and crashing his lips onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was raw, desperate, and fiercely possessive. He kissed her like a man who had just survived the apocalypse, pouring every ounce of his terror and love into her. Zoya kissed him back just as hard, her hands tangling in his dark hair, entirely surrendering to the monster who had become her savior. 3 hours later, the grand hall was cleared of the dead. The remaining rebel soldiers were kneeling in the courtyard in heavy iron chains. But inside the throne room, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The surviving nobles, the council elders, and the royal guard were all present. They stood in absolute, terrified silence. The heavy doors opened. Lorcan walked in. He wasn't wearing his battle armor. He wore the dark, tailored velvet of a monarch, but the kingdom wasn't looking at the king. They were looking at the woman walking beside him. Zoya wore a stunning gown of midnight blue silk. The heavy ancestral silver crown sat perfectly on her head. The brutal, undeniable mark of the Alpha King was dark and prominent on her neck, entirely healing but proudly visible. Her eyes glowed with a faint, deadly violet light. She was no longer a human prisoner. She was the Nightwalker Queen. Lord Kaelin's remaining loyalists dropped to their knees the moment she stepped onto the dais. It wasn't out of respect. It was out of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. They had seen her crush an army with a single thought. Lorcan didn't sit on his throne. He stood beside it, turning to face the crowd. "My uncle, General Vane, is dead," Lorcan announced, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. "The rebellion is crushed, and the woman standing beside me is the sole reason any of you are breathing tonight." He turned to Zoya. In front of the entire, terrified nobility of the North, the Savage King took her hand and kissed her knuckles. "If anyone questions her bloodline, her magic, or her right to rule," Lorcan said, his golden eyes sweeping the crowd like a loaded weapon, "I will not execute you. I will let the Queen handle it." Zoya looked down at the kneeling lords. She didn't smile. She didn't offer mercy. She simply let the dark, freezing aura of her magic drift across the floor, chilling the room by 10 degrees. "Long live the Queen," Bracken shouted from the front of the room, slamming his fist over his heart. "Long live the Queen," the entire hall echoed, bowing their heads in absolute submission. The heavy oak doors of the royal chambers clicked shut. The roar of the celebrating castle faded into silence. The room was warm, lit by a roaring fire in the massive stone hearth. Lorcan didn't move toward the bed. He leaned against the heavy wooden door, watching Zoya as she walked to the mirror and slowly removed the silver crown. The tension in the room instantly spiked. The public dominance of the throne room was gone, replaced by the heavy, suffocating magnetism of the bedroom. "You enjoyed that," Lorcan murmured, his voice dropping an octave. Zoya turned around, leaning back against the vanity table. "Enjoyed what?" "Watching the men who wanted me dead bow at my feet." "Yes." He pushed off the door, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. The predator was back. "You looked like a goddess of war up there." "I am whatever I need to be to survive you, Lorcan." "You don't need to survive me anymore, Zoya," he whispered, stopping just inches from her. His large hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest. "You own me." He ducked his head, his lips tracing the sensitive skin of her jawline, moving down to the dark, permanent bite mark on her neck. He kissed it reverently. Zoya gasped, her fingers digging into his broad shoulders. The sheer heat radiating from his massive frame was intoxicating. Every wall, every defense she had built against him completely shattered. She tilted her head back, fully submitting to the overwhelming weight of the mate bond, but retaining all the power of a queen. Then prove it, Lorcan growled, a dark, primal sound of pure obsession. He swept her off her feet, carrying her to the massive canopy bed. The rest of the night was consumed by fire. It was a claiming of souls, an absolute merging of shadow and light, a fierce, desperate confirmation that they were both finally alive. Hours later, the castle was entirely silent. Zoya slept deeply, her head resting on Lorcan's chest. The Alpha King's arm was wrapped securely around her waist, his breathing slow and steady. The nightmare was finally over. The throne was secure. But magic always demands a price. In the absolute darkness of the room, Zoya's neck pulsed. The dark bite mark, where Lorcan had violently mixed his alpha blood with her ancient Nightwalker magic, began to glow. A single tiny drop of liquid violet energy seeped from the scar. It didn't fall onto the bed sheets. The drop of pure, concentrated magic phased straight through the mattress. It sank through the heavy stone floor of the royal chambers. It dropped through the dungeons, through the deep bedrock of the castle foundations, descending miles into the pitch-black core of the continent. Deep underground, in a cavern that had not seen light for 10,000 years, the drop of purple magic hit the floor. The earth violently shuddered. In the infinite darkness, two colossal, terrifying eyes snapped open. They were entirely made of roaring, apocalyptic fire. The ancient thing beneath the continent took its first breath in a millennium, and it was incredibly hungry.